Welcome everyone to CCN 2019 here in beautiful Berlin. And I would like to say, I hope you feel the force. And at least for our European colleagues, they may be feeling very energetic and feeling the force. But if you did come from, say, from America or Asia, you might be a little dead with jet lag. So it's all right. We've got your back. We'll take care of it. So, who are we? We come here because we're trying to understand what cognitive computational neuroscience is, and so I thought I would try to define that with emojis. So we have here cognitive science, which attempts to take computational and mathematical models and explain thinking and behavior. There is cognitive neuroscience, which has been working at mapping brain function onto the brain. We have systems neuroscience, which is taking direct measurements in a wet laboratory of single spiking neurons and populations of spiking neurons. And we have computational neuroscience, which attempts to use computational and mathematical models to make sense of the spikes that come from systems neuroscience. And so we all know that there's a link between cognitive science and cognitive neuroscience. But this new thing has happened that machine learning has really come to the fore with deep learning models. And in particular, we can now make models of complex tasks that we can really understand and attempt to draw parallels to the brain. There's also connections between systems neuroscience and computational neuroscience, obviously. And some would say that there are connections between computational neuroscience and machine learning. Now, if there's anyone who's a machine learning researcher in the room, you may not be quite sure about that. So at least there is some dialogue between these two communities. And so maybe that's enough. All right. So the idea, in at least how I've thought about it, is that we're taking the machine learning tools and attempting to join together to really have a conference where we're thinking about computation, behavior, and modeling of brains. So if you do one of these word clouds on the abstracts, you'll see that the big words are, we really love neural network models, and not so much the theory. Right, so I searched really hard for that word. So there are two close to my heart. There's dynamics and Bayesian thinking, fMRI studies, perceptual, presumably decision-making, and so forth. So that's really, if you look at the words, who we are and what we're all about. Okay, so in terms of who we are, well, who are the organizers? The executive committee was chaired by Thomas Nesselaris. The program committee was chaired by Nico Kriegeskorte. The communications committee, Kendra Kay. Sponsorships, Ali Fletcher. And I helped run the review process. And we have some local organizers as well. So I thought I would take a few minutes to run you through some of the highlights of the program, sort of get you oriented and see how you think about that. So the tutorials have already happened if you missed them. That's unfortunate. So let's take a moment to thank our speakers at the tutorials. Great. So we have our keynote speakers, the invited speakers for this conference, and I've sort of listed them from sort of cognitive science down to machine learning in some arbitrary order. We have Liz Spelke, who focuses on the sources of uniquely human cognitive capacities, including the capacity for formal mathematics. Tim Behrens, using computational and mathematical models to understand how the brain stores information about the relationships between things in the world. Talia Konkel, she characterizes representational spaces of the mind and how they are mapped onto the surface of the brain. We have Nathaniel Doss studying how people and animals learn from trial and error and to make decisions, combining computational, neural, and behavioral perspectives. We have Roshan Kuls investigating motivational and cognitive control processes in humans with and without neuropsychiatric problems. Anne Churchland, who studies the population responses in rodents to understand neural mechanisms of decision-making, for example, multisensory integration. We have Mate Lengyel, who uses computational, Bayesian, and predictive coding approaches to understand how the brain computes. We have also Nando de Freitas, an innovator and researcher in machine learning, deep learning, and Bayesian inference. And last but not least, we have Bernard Scholkopf, who's a leading researcher in machine learning, obviously, and he is particularly active in the field of kernel methods. So you can see that there's a lot on our plate, and it reminds me of the first day. I'm a Googler, so I work at Google, and we get the free lunches, and I'm sort of feeling like this right now. Okay, so now it's time for the Best Paper Awards. And so the way that this works is that we took a subset of papers that were all very high scoring and very well thought of through the review process, and we passed them to our advisory committee, who went through and sort of looked at every one of these papers individually and came to some consensus about the best paper, and I use best in quotes because all the work is great. Who the hell are we kidding? Sorry, what I meant to say is I'd like to thank my own abilities. Okay, so anyways, first we have a memory-augmented reinforcement learning model of food caching behavior in birds. And this is by Johanny Brea and Wolfram Gerstner, and I apologize if I don't have the names correctly. So if one of you are here, I have a certificate, if you want to come get it. All right, then the next award goes to the paper on the relational structure of a reinforcement learning task is represented and generalized in the entorhinal cortex by Alon Barham, Timothy Muller, Hamid Neely, Mona Gervert, and Timothy Behrens. I think Alon is here if you want to come up and receive a certificate. Okay, and for those of you next year, there's always a chance. Okay, so the next thing that we're doing, which is I think reasonably unique to this conference, is our mind matching. And so when I first heard about the mind matching, I was a little bit like Suspicious Chloe, and so I didn't really know what it was about. So let me tell you a little bit about it. Basically, on Saturday, it starts on Saturday at 2 p.m., and there's a brief overview of what's going on at 12:30, so you can get even more orientation. And basically, the idea is that you go through 6 rounds of talking to people about your work, and those rounds last for about 12 minutes, and then you switch up for a few minutes, and that's how it goes, right? So please do attend if you signed up, because if you're shy, you're going to leave your partners high and dry. And so now maybe you'll be happy, Chloe, after learning that it's really pretty fun. Okay. In addition, we have the Challenges and Controversies section of the program. In this case, it will be the Free Energy Principle, where Carl Friston and Jeff Beck will discuss the promises and perils of the Free Energy Principle. This is on Sunday, that's 2, and this is located in the main hall here. We have breakout sessions, for example, talking about state-space models, forming a bridge between theory and data. How can we measure and model the dynamics of interacting minds? And how can we design cognitive tasks that challenge both cognitive and neural network models? That's Sunday. And then on Monday, how should we benchmark models in cognitive computational neuroscience? Can we test cognitive models with brain activity data? How can we model the computations of human language perception and production? Great. So then, nearing the end of the conference, we'll have the community meeting. And in this case, if you're interested in becoming a CCN organizer, or simply curious about the past and the future of CCN, we'll provide an open mic. And in particular, we can discuss issues, future directions, what's going well, what we need to improve on, and also discuss the environmental impact and sustainability of the conference. And that is on Monday, 17:20, here in the main auditorium. Next year, we'll be holding CCN 2020 in San Francisco. It's a beautiful place. There's lots of interesting things to see and do. You should come. Okay, so we'd like to thank the NSF because they have awarded about 20 travel awards, and so that enabled these researchers to attend this conference. Thank you very much. And of course, we would like to thank our broad sponsors, without whom the conference simply wouldn't happen. One more time. Okay, so I hope I've given you enough information to realize that the next few days are going to blow your mind. All right, so without any further wackiness, Heinrike Nienburg is coming up to introduce Liz Spelke.
It's my pleasure to introduce Liz Spelke from Harvard University as the first keynote speakers of this meeting. And this lecture is being sponsored by Nature Human Behavior, and Marike Schiffer, senior editor at Nature Human Behavior, is in the audience. Thank you very much. So Dr. Spelke is best known for showing that infants enter the world equipped with a coherent system of core knowledge in key domains such as objects, numbers, agents, and space. Sorry about that. So she has led the development of experimental methods for studying infants' knowledge separate from their ability to act, and by those methods has driven a movement from the Piagetian paradigm examining knowledge through actions to a post-Piagetian area of looking at both innate domain knowledge and expectations formed through unsupervised observational learning. It's almost no exaggeration that if it weren't for her work on what and how much infants actually know about the world, we might still think that babies' experience of the world is a blooming, buzzing confusion, as William James described it. Her work has been tremendously influential both in psychology and AI by demonstrating the importance of what Lake and colleagues refer to as the startup software of human intelligence. So please help me in welcoming Dr. Spelke.
Computer just froze. There it is. I don't think I'll need a pointer, but if it's there, I'll be able to grab it then. And that will go away. Okay, great. Yes, thank you, Heinrike, for that lovely introduction. And thanks to all of the organizers. Thanks to Nature Human Behavior for a great journal and also for sponsoring this talk and letting me come here. I'm really happy to be at this meeting. So what is going on here? This didn't happen when we set it up earlier. Okay, wait, it's all messed up, the format. We tried it out earlier, it worked fine. I'm not sure what's happened. Whoops. Yeah, that's it, I'm done. Okay, here's the question that I want to put on the table for today. I submit that of every entity that we know of, be it an intelligent machine or an extremely intelligent adult, the entity that has the highest degree of general intelligence, the highest capacity to develop a common sense understanding of the world, is not any of us in this room, but the children that we had or will have, children from roughly birth to 5 years of age, who come into the world knowing almost nothing, but before they get to school and without anybody sitting down and explicitly teaching them anything, because even in the most academic families, I think we spend most of our time trying to get them to go to sleep at night, to keep them from falling and hurting themselves and so forth, keep them out of trouble, not trying to explicitly teach young children. And in fact, studies show that if you do try to explicitly teach young children, they're quite recalcitrant to learning what you're trying to teach them. So without much prompting from the external world, they're thrust into it, and they learn an extraordinary amount over the first 5 or so years of life. That's when they master their native language, something we may struggle to do with other languages later. It's when they master a vast repertoire of concepts, of kinds of objects and their functions, and I'll be talking about that in the second half of my talk today. They also, some things I won't be talking about, they master the ins and outs of their immediate social network, the conventions by which people behave with each other, a whole bunch of cultural products from songs to basic skills of all sorts. And perhaps most interestingly, they master the symbols and the systematic beliefs and values of their culture. And one of the things that makes this so striking, this ability, is that if you look across human history, or if you look from one culture to another, what you see is that the stuff they have to master varies a lot from one place to another. Every culture has some form of visual art and music and technology, but the particular technologies change and music and art change enormously from one time to another and vary a lot from one place to another. So do the basic ways of measuring space and time, and of course, the systematic developed understanding of mathematics and science and ethics and other domains of knowledge. This is all very variable, and by the time kids get to school, they're ready to learn the stuff that is, the aspects of this that are taught in school because they have a general purpose, common sense understanding of the world. So my question is, what allows children to learn so fast and so flexibly? I think we understand cases in which learning can be very fast because it's constrained and relatively inflexible, and also cases in which learning can require a lot of data and be flexible, but unless you have exceedingly fast machines, it's going to proceed slowly. As one imagines instantiating it in a human, it would proceed slowly. Yet these kids seem to be learning both fast and flexibly. So what makes that happen? Well, I'm not going to give you the answer today. This is not a solved problem. But I want to suggest quite boldly that I think it's a solvable problem. And I think it's solvable with currently available knowledge and technology methods for addressing it, which is why I'm excited to talk with all of you about it here today. Now, one of the ways in which I think we can make some headway in solving this problem is through the classic questions and methods of developmental psychology, which is the field I'll be representing today. I was actually trained as a perceptual and cognitive psychologist, but I've spent a lot of time studying kids, so I guess I've become a developmental psychologist over time, conducting behavioral research on infants and children. But one thing I've become convinced of over the years is that developmental psychology cannot solve this problem alone. We can study infants and young children all day long, and we'll learn a lot of things, but we will not learn how, what their learning mechanisms are that allow children to learn so fast and flexibly. For this, I think we need an interdisciplinary enterprise. Part of that interdisciplinary enterprise draws on other behavioral sciences from the social sciences and the natural sciences. Behavioral research focused on other animals, focused on people at different ages, focused on people from different cultures, and so forth. Some of it has to require, I think, research on brains, as David was laying out, both systems neuroscience, looking deeply at specific brain functions, and also cognitive neuroscience in humans and other animals. And I think it requires research in AI and machine learning and other areas of computational cognitive science. In other words, that's why I'm here, okay? And my goal is to try to make plausible the idea that right now we can make progress and actually move toward understanding how children learn. And by doing that, developing an understanding of a more impressive learning capacity than any that we currently, I think, are working on and close to understanding. Okay, so that's where I'm going. A bit of a roadmap. I want to start with a little bit of history. I taught in this wonderful summer school this summer, the School for Brains, Minds, and Machines, and discovered that there were people there who didn't know what that is. So I'm going to tell you about work in the 1950s on the origins of the capacity to perceive depth. That's a visual cliff. I want to spend a little bit of time on that. But then I will shift and I'll talk about I'll move from perception to higher cognition, say something about what infants know and what the properties of their knowledge systems, what properties their knowledge systems seem to have. Then I'm going to focus on one example of children's uniquely human, I think, learning capacity that we see emerging at the end of the first year of life, when kids first start treating objects as instances of kinds with dedicated forms and functions. That'll be my example from today. I do talk about mathematics and do research on it sometimes, but I'm not going to talk about that today. I want to offer a hypothesis to explain kids' learning in this case, and I think in other cases, like the case of formal mathematics, and end by suggesting how I think we can test these hypotheses using all the interdisciplinary methods that are represented in this room. Okay, so I'm starting with Eleanor Gibson, the inventor of the visual cliff. She was trained in the 1940s. She did the work I'm going to talk about in the 1950s. And her training was in psychophysics, studying spatial vision. She looked at the research at the time. It was primarily done in laboratories and wanted to take it out into the field. So she did a series of studies that she and her husband, James Gibson, called open-air psychophysics, where they took Navy recruits and looked at their depth perception as they walked through fields and looked at moving objects and things like that. Discovered many of the properties of optic flow that underlie spatial vision. And then she became interested in development and in how animals develop the ability to use optic flow. And her hypothesis was that this is learned, that animals move around, and by moving, they see how the world is moving around them, and they learn to perceive depth. So she went to work at the Cornell Behavior Farm, where she was going to study learning in goats. And the first step to studying learning, if you want to start at birth, is to participate in the birthing of those goats. And she discovered at that point that when a goat, they're born as twins, and when a goat was born, the person, the vet who helped with the delivery, would put the firstborn on a very narrow stool. And the goat simply stood there. It didn't try to move around, fall off the stool. So she then tried taking the goat and putting it down on the ground. She thought maybe they just don't walk or move at birth. She put it on the ground and it started moving around. And that raised the question, what was guiding the goat? What was telling it not to move when it was on the stool and to move when it was on the ground? And she designed the visual cliff to see whether visual information might be playing that role. So the visual cliff has a center board where she could put the goat. It's got two plexiglass surfaces immediately below the center board, so the goat can step off any which way at once, and it's not going to fall. But on one side, there's a pattern immediately below that plexiglass, and on the other side, it's like 3 or 4 feet lower, okay? So on the deeper side, it looks deep. And she reported that even the research assistants who had to clean this device didn't really like going out over the deep side. It looks deep, but tactily it's the same on both sides. And she tested goats and found that they avoid the deep side of the cliff from birth, readily go down on the shallow side. She tested human infants, who you can't test until they get to be about 7 months of age because they don't move around on their own before then, and found that as early as they start moving on their own, parents can easily convince them to go over the shallow side and have to work a whole lot harder to get them to go over the deep side. They tend to avoid it. She also studied rats, who were interesting because rats don't open their eyes until they're about 2 weeks of age, and start moving around at that point. It's actually usually a few days after, I believe, after they open their eyes, where they first start systematically venturing away from the nest. So she asked what would be happening in that intervening time. She found that after a few days, when they would venture away from the nest, they would cross only on the shallow side, not the deep side. But to see what role visual experience might be playing in that, she did a controlled rearing experiment. So she divided the rats into 2 groups. From the moment that their eyes were opened, one group was placed in the dark, the other group was given normal lighted environment, and then when they started moving around on their own a couple days later, she put them on the center board of the cliff, and found that the 2 groups' behavior was indistinguishable. They both avoided the deep side of the cliff, including the rats who were in a lighted environment for the first time when they were put on that center board at the test. She also studied cats, and they were more interesting. So what happened with the cats was she did the same kind of design of a dark rearing experiment, and the group of cats that was reared in the light started avoiding the cliff, the deep side of the cliff, immediately when they were placed on the center board. But the cats that were reared in the dark and only were placed on the center board the very first time, that was the very first time they were placed in the light, they did not avoid the deep side. They went off both sides. And at this point she asked, what could they be learning? And 2 days later, they started avoiding the deep side of the cliff. So the question was, what could they be learning over those 2 days? And to see, the 2 general possibilities were, there's something about visual experience that just primes a system that's all ready to go, and it takes 2 days for that to start up, versus there's something about the experience of moving around in the world and relating what you see to the effects of your own actions that's having this effect. So to distinguish those 2 possibilities, she ran another group of cats who were reared in a lighted environment for the 2 days when the others had been reared. Were reared in a lighted environment for the 2 days when the others had been reared in the dark, but the environment consisted exclusively of the visual cliff. So they were placed on the center board. They moved off in both directions, on the deep side and on the shallow side, for the first day. And the question was, what would happen after that? And what happened was, after 2 days, they looked just like the cats who had been reared entirely in the dark. That is, they began to avoid the deep side of the cliff, even though all of their experience should have taught them that both sides were equally safe, right? I mean, they could go down on both sides. They were equally well supported. But over time, as they got used to using vision to guide their action, they used it in the same way that the other animals with different kinds of experiences had had. So the conclusion from these studies, now, Gibson didn't draw the conclusion that depth perception is innate, because innate was a taboo word at the time that she did these studies. However, I think that's what these studies showed. It's innate in a very simple and straightforward, testable sense. It's not shaped by experience with the things that it comes to represent. Right? This is a system for representing drop-offs. It's not shaped by experience with drop-offs. These cats came to have this system after experiencing only safety as they looked at a visual information for a drop-off. So studies of innateness are testable. Here's a test for one. It's been done in all of these different animals. It's not saying that experience doesn't have subsequent effects on things to claim that something is innate. It's not to say that it's not changeable. It's not to say that it's not modulated by experiences of other kinds, but it's not learned by interacting with entities that have the properties that you're learning about, in this case, a visible drop-off. So she did one more thing, and by the way, I'm taking you through all of this because I'm going to be using all of these methods in talking about cognition for the rest of this talk. The other general thing she was concerned to do was to ask, are cats a good model for perceptual learning in humans? Are any of these models a good model? So she did, in each case, a wealth of psychophysical experiments, asking, in effect, do we see mechanisms with the same psychophysical signatures across all of these different animals? And the findings were that she did, okay? Basically, the same patterns of optic flow that guide a goat or guide an infant once they start, a human infant, once they start to locomote on their own, and that guide the cats. There's a convergence across these different studies. They seem to be relying on the same underlying mechanisms. So from that, she concluded that depth perception depends on ancient mechanisms, mechanisms that evolved before we did in some ancestor that's common to us and all of these other mammals. And because of that, it can be studied in model animals using both the techniques of systems neuroscience and techniques of controlled rearing, and both together to try to get at the role and nature of experience effects on the developing brain and mind. What's more, she was able to show all this with really simple behavioral methods. She didn't have a lot of grant support at that time. She didn't have opportunities for doing, well, nobody had opportunities for doing the kinds of studies that you can do today. But simply using untrained, visually guided locomotion as her indicator response, she was able to run this entire program of research. Of course, it's limited in what it can tell you about young infants because they don't move around on their own. She was also a pioneer of using other measures, especially looking time, which I'll be talking about in the second half of this talk, to get at infants' responses to visual information before they're able to move around on their own. Okay, so what do infants know? If we take these methods and this perspective and we apply them to questions in higher cognition, not what does the world look like to an infant and how do they control their actions in that world, but what do they understand about the things that populate the world and the ways in which they behave? I think what we find, if we take studies, behavioral studies of infants, consider them in relation to behavioral studies of a much wider range population of entities, from people at older ages to people in other cultures to animals of other species, and put all that together with the multiple methods from neuroscience and artificial intelligence and machine learning. Here is my best current sense of what we find in young infants. I think we find evidence for 6 systems of what I call core knowledge, and what I'm going to be trying to do for the next 20 minutes or so is give you a sense of what a core knowledge system is. These are systems that center on, I'll start with just a general overview. They center on abstract, interconnected concepts. And I put here what on this slide what the central concepts are, the evidence suggests, for each of these core systems. I'll come back and say more about objects and agents and places as we go along. These systems are radically limited. So babies come into the world knowing almost nothing about what objects do. They don't know that balls roll and blocks don't roll. They don't know what a spoon can be picked up off a table, but a hook can't be picked up off a wall. They have almost no knowledge about the specific properties of objects. They have knowledge of the general properties that apply to all objects and that can be used for tracking them and so forth. So each of these systems is limited in these ways. Each system activates a set of relatively specific and separable mechanisms in the brain that can be studied. When one considers the abstract concepts at the center of each of these systems and the limits to those systems and the brain mechanisms that are activated by them, we get evidence that these systems are shared by other animals. It's not just that we have ways of representing objects and other animals have ways of representing objects, but the signatures of these systems from behavioral studies and from neural studies converge with each other, suggesting, as they did for the visual cliff, suggesting an underlying common mechanism. These systems are innate in the sense that I just described. They're not shaped by encounters with the things that they serve to represent, though they're clearly very flexible and modified by experience of those sorts. They emerge early and they're present throughout life. That's not the case for all of our innate abilities, but these are present early and continue to be present. And I think at every point in development, they're supporting children's learning and also our learning as adults. So what I want to do to try to flesh out these general properties of this system is to take a single domain. And in recent years, most of my talks and the research in my lab have been about the domains of objects and agents and persons and number, not about places, though I did do about 20 years of research on representation of places. But in thinking about this meeting and what you're trying to accomplish, and also thinking about some of the really important recent findings that have been coming out in the field, springing from the fields of navigation and spatial representation, I've decided that today I want to focus on this area to lay out in a bit more detail each of these 6 properties of core knowledge. So I'll focus on core knowledge of places. And I should tell you where I started in this field. I started with a question that I'm still very fond of and a spectacular incorrect prediction about an experiment that could test it. The question is, what's special about human learning that distinguishes human learning from learning in other animals? And the way I wanted to test it was to use a phenomenon that Randy Gallistel and Ken Cheng had discovered in rats. They had taken rats, they were interested in how rats get a sense of where they are in space from the perceptible world around them. So they had taken rats and done experiments where they let the rats get hungry, showed them where food was partially buried in a rectangular chamber, then took them out of the chamber, spun them around, removed the food and sort of smoothed over the floor, and let them back in the chamber so that they could dig for the food. And they found that rats tended to dig at 2 locations. They dug at the correct location where the food actually was, and they dug at a second location that was symmetrical equivalent, geometrically equivalent to that first location, the opposite corner of the room. In doing so, they ignored the fact that one of the 4 walls was white and the others were black. They ignored the fact that each corner had a different odor coming from it, that there were different patterns on the walls and so forth. They seemed only to rely on the shape of the room. And I was sure that young children wouldn't do that, so I wanted to do a comparable experiment on them. So we didn't food deprive the children, but we did meanly take their toy away that they had brought from home, and we put it in a corner, and we picked them up and spun them around until they were disoriented. Because for rats, as for kids, if you're oriented, you'll use path integration and you'll go to the correct place. But we wanted them to actually use information from the room itself. So we spun them around and disoriented them and then let them go get their toy. And just like the rats, they went to the 2 opposite corners of the room. Half the time, actually, an individual kid would only go to 1 corner. Half of them went to the correct corner, and the other half went to the corner on the opposite side of the room. In our first studies, they were ignoring a brightly colored wall. We didn't believe the findings, so we tried other cues that for them to use, like another really exciting toy that they got to play with that was near the corner where their own toy was going to be hidden. That didn't work. We tried many things. I'm just giving you a couple of examples. We tried an object that could serve as the hiding place for the toy, okay? So if we hid the toy in a can, Indeed, we found that they would search there, showing that they, like rats, can use something in landmarks in the room to guide their spatial behavior. But the question was, how are they using this landmark? Is it just a beacon, or is it giving them information about where things are in the environment? So to distinguish between those, we first showed that kids could remember 2 different things if you hid them in 2 different locations. And then we hid one thing in the can and another thing in the corner of the room. Okay? And then encouraged kids to search for both of them. And what kids did was they searched in the can for the thing that was hidden there every time. But as far as the corners went, half the time they went to the corner near the can, and half the time they went to the other corner. So they weren't using it as a landmark, marking where they were and where objects were in the environment. It seems like they have 2 separate processes, representations they can draw on here. One, the can as a beacon. You can find things if you go to the can. The other, something about the shape of the room as indicating where things are in space and where they are, so they can reorient themselves once they become disoriented. Well, what is it about the room that they were using? In our case, we had walls, pairs of walls that differed in length. Is that the information they would use? Jane Ellen Huttenlocher and Stella Lourenco did a whole series of studies to try to get at whether other properties of walls would also be used by presenting kids with square rooms and coloring the walls differently. In one study, they had opposite walls that were red alternating with opposite walls that were blue. In other studies, they used the displays I've got here, walls with X's on them versus walls with circles on them, or walls with a pattern on them versus walls that are a uniform gray. In all of these cases, when an object was hidden in a corner, kids searched the 4 corners equally. They didn't use any of that information. So we thought they must be using the length of the walls, but we were wrong, because if you present them with equidistant walls of the different length relations that one finds in a rectangular room, they didn't use that either. They did, however, use the relative distances of the walls from each other, or from the center of the room, or from the child themselves. These are indistinguishable possibilities in this paradigm. They used the relative distances of the walls when the walls were equal in length. So we thought, oh great, they'll use the relative distances of corners as well, and they did not do that. So where are we? It looks like so far, kids are determining where they are by, in relation to something about the bounding surfaces of the environment. Not in relation to something about objects, although they can remember objects and find things that are hidden directly at them. They're not using the length of walls or the colors of walls or the patterning of walls, but they are using something about the distances at which walls are placed, and also the directions of the walls relative to each other, because they're not distinguishing, they're distinguishing the corner with the the corner that's to the left of a distant wall from the corner that's to the right of a distant wall, okay? Is all this clear? These are all overhead views and everything. I've made that clear? Okay, great. So that's where we are so far, but then there was one final really intriguing finding, I thought, from Huttenlocher and Lourenco. They found another condition in which kids could succeed, and this was a case where a room is square, and you have big circles, widely spaced, on 2 of the walls, and smaller circles, densely spaced, on the other 2 walls. And now, when something was hidden in one corner, they went to the corner that had the correct left-right relationships to the big circles versus the smaller circles. Now, initially, this seemed really surprising, but thinking about it in connection with the evidence that kids respond to the distances of surfaces suggested that maybe what the circles are doing is not serving as a cue for reorientation, but as a cue to depth, which is leading the children to perceive the wall, the room, as being rectangular, even though it's actually square. So we tested that by presenting slightly rectangular rooms and finding what the smallest rectangular room was, the one that's closest to a square that the kids could reliably detect, and then putting them in a room that was halfway between the one that they could detect and one that was so close to square that they couldn't detect it, and putting dots on the walls. And of course, there are two conditions. In one condition, put the dots on the walls that are actually a little bit closer, the big dots on the walls that are actually a little bit closer. So now it should seem more rectangular. The other condition, put the big dots on the walls that are actually a little bit further away. It should seem more square. And indeed, those were the findings from that study. You were right about. No place to put this. So what do we conclude from this? Well, I think this study is telling us that the mechanisms by which children are navigating to the environment are happening in a cognitive system that's coming after the mechanisms that Eleanor Gibson was studying on the visual cliff. It's coming after perception of the visible surface layout. It's taking the perceived surface layout as input, the perceived distances and directions of surfaces, and not responding directly to visual patterns at all. Okay, it's not this system. There's no inconsistency between the inability to respond to other visual patterns in studies of rats and of children and these findings. But this, of course, raised a whole family of questions, like what are the entities whose geometrical, they're representing distance and direction are geometrical properties, right? What are the entities that they're applying this geometrical analysis to? Now, my favorite recent study that's looked at this was conducted in China by Yiqing Hu and her students. And it used a rectangular room, but she put a sloping ceiling on the rectangular room and hid an object in one corner and asked whether kids would use any of the following geometric properties to distinguish that corner from the opposite one. First of all, the two more distant walls are different heights. One of them is twice as tall as the other. Second, the two larger, closer walls differ in shape. They're asymmetrical. And third, you've got this big sloping ceiling that's coming down, right? So will kids navigate by any of those properties and reorient themselves, distinguishing the correct corner at which to search? And the answer was no. Their responses were identical to the responses of kids in a rectangular room, which they replicated in their lab. So what I think this is saying is we can be much more specific about what these limits to reorientation are. They're not really representing the walls. They're representing boundaries to the floor, but not the walls themselves, because the walls can differ twofold in height, and that's not entering their decisions about where they are in space and therefore where the hidden object is. The next question then was, how big do the walls have to be in order for them to have any effect in this situation? So Sang Ali, who did all the other studies I'm going to tell you about, came along and started testing kids in walls that were progressively smaller and smaller, closer and closer to the ground. First, she showed that it works just fine if the kids can see over the walls. Then she showed it worked fine if they could step over the walls. And finally, she got to the point where what kids were presented with was just a little 2-centimeter high frame on the floor. They used that. They also used bumps on the floor that didn't have any sharp corners or discontinuities in them. But when the display was flattened completely, so it was simply a rectangular black surface in an otherwise cylindrical room, now kids showed that they detected the surface, because if you hid something in a corner, they only went to corners of it, but they did not rely on its shape. Okay? Similarly, when columns were put in the room in a rectangular arrangement, kids didn't rely on that either. So I think based on all these findings, we can revise what the limits are. What's being represented here is the ground surface and its spatial structure, okay, including really tiny perturbations in its three-dimensional structure as the kid moves around in it. Again, not objects or walls or other surface markings. Now, at this point, I'm going to come back to research in neuroscience, but I want first to jump to the question, is this system shared by other animals? Because I can use all the studies I just told you about to ask that question. First of all, Huttenlocher and Lourenco not only tested young children with the square rooms with the different size patterns on the walls, they also tested mice, and they found the same pattern in mice as they had found with children. Sang-Ah Lee, who did the studies on wall length versus distance. Sorry, let me take the one above first. She's the one who did the studies with the little frame on the floor. She did the same thing with chicks. Chicks showed the same pattern of performance as children had. And then she did the same studies of length versus distance with zebrafish. I really thought zebrafish would be different. They're moving around in three-dimensional space, for one thing. For another, they're moving in a tank, and there must be lots of information from the waves that get set up as you move around in a tank for where the walls actually are. But in fact, the fish only reoriented by visual information and only by the information from surface distance that was used by the children. So what this is telling us is that, as in the case of the visual cliff work that Gibson did, there are common behavioral signatures of this navigation system across humans and a very wide range of other animals. So now let me get to the brain, because all of the work that some of you are doing on the brain is what inspired me to dig up this work and talk about behavioral studies of place representations in the first place. So everyone knows the work on place cells and the ways in which place cell firing is modulated by changes to an environment. Such that place cells maintain a constant distance and direction from the borders of a room, each cell selecting one or two borders that it anchors itself to, and changing its firing when distance and directional relationships change. This is the work of Neil Burgess and John O'Keefe, where rats start out in the little square room and then the walls start getting moved out to make either a rectangle that goes one way or a rectangle that goes a different way. The study also shows that the place cells are very limited in the types of geometrical information they're using. They're not using information for the shape of the environment, because if they were, the big square has the same shape as the small square, and they should have simply scaled up the place cell firing, but that's not what it's doing. It's anchoring itself to one of these borders. They also showed that you can take the corners away. Remember, Sang-Ah Lee had found kids don't reorient by distances and directions of corners. You can take a square room and you can smooth off all those corners, and as long as you still have enough extended flat surface present, the cells continue firing in the same way. And of course, near the hippocampus and surrounding cortex, all sorts of other cells consistent with the focus we see in the behavioral research on the borders of the ground surface. So-called border cells and head direction cells whose firing changes as properties of the borders of the ground surface change, extended surfaces change, but not when objects are put into the room. Now, of course, what's so wonderful about all of the work in neuroscience on navigation is that as neuroscientists, you're able to find things that I don't even begin to know how to look for as a behavioral psychologist, like grid cells, or like processes of mental simulation. I figured out a lot of things about how you can test infants on what they know about things they can't see, but how could you test a simulation process behaviorally in an infant? I have no idea. Beautiful, rich work, and this is what's really motivated me to take another look at this whole field. Another thing that I don't know how to study overtly in an infant is action planning, because early on their actions develop so slowly. But I think you get beautiful opportunities to see action planning in navigating animals, especially rats, who only activate this place system when they're in a task where they have to be representing space. They only activate it when they're moving through an environment themselves under their own power, not when they're being passively carried from one place to another. Putting that together, with the finding that at rest, you can see reactivation of these place cells and surrounding cortical areas, suggests, I think, very strongly that this system is involved. It's activated by action planning, not by overt movements through space, but by planning movements through space, which can accompany overt actions, but can also happen outside of them. But it doesn't happen if there's no planning involved. Now, what of course is really exciting about all of this work are the recent findings that have shown comparable phenomena in humans using MEG and fMRI to what had been found with the microelectrode recording with rats. I think there's growing evidence for mechanisms of navigation themselves, and also growing evidence for perceptual mechanisms in temporal cortex that support the navigation system by representing scenes in ways that privilege the ground surface and the one's location in it. So I think all of this work is coming together in a really beautiful way. It's totally lame for me to just say the common mechanisms they're here, they're in the medial temporal part of the brain, right? But I don't have space to put in all of the rich findings that have been learned there. But I do want to note that I think the fact that we see homology at the level of neural mechanism as well as at the level of behavior makes the conclusion that these are ancient systems much stronger, much more confident. Okay, there's just very, very rich evidence for a shared heritage here in the mechanisms by which we represent space. So finally, let me talk about the last three properties. First of all, innateness. I'll stay with neuroscience for a minute and just point to the work that, of course, is very well known, that was conducted almost 10 years ago now on baby rats. At the point where they become old enough to be in the visual cliff, they also become old enough to navigate on their own away from the nest through an environment, on average about 2 days after their eyes open. And already at the beginning, they've got directional cells that fire when they're facing in a particular direction, and place cells, which will improve in their stability over time, but they're already functional quite early on. The grid cells, interestingly, develop later. Border cells, the ones in entorhinal cortex that are that fire in relation to the distance and direction of a particular surface in the array, are also mature when the infant rats first start exploring the environment. And interestingly, although firing on many dimensions improves with age, when you dissociate age from experience, you see that age has larger effects than experience does. So there's clearly learning involved, I think, especially for the grid cell system, but also maturation and non-specific effects of experience as the animals get more comfortable moving around and probably get better at action planning as well. So all of these studies tell us that these abilities are present and functioning early in life. They don't yet tell us that they're innate because of those 2 days that the rats had their eyes open before they start leaving the nest and are looking around at spatially structured environments. So my first plea to those of you who are in neuroscience is please go back to the 1950s, at least in this respect, and consider doing controlled rearing studies on these animals. I think it's a highly testable question whether rats who get visual experience, but no experience that's relevant to navigating in relation to a spatially structured environment would show these effects. In the absence of that, let me give you evidence, though, from behavioral experiments that have used controlled rearing on the chicks. This is not work of Sang Ali, it's work of Cinzia Chiandetti and Giorgio Villortagara in Trento, Italy. But they used chicks because chicks had shown these very similar patterns of performance to human infants in navigating tasks. What they did is they reared chicks in the dark and then exposed them to a single object. They were reared alone and then exposed to a single object to which they could imprint. So for the chick, this object is going to become mom over the 2 days in which it's bouncing around in the chamber that they're in. And they ran the chicks in 2 conditions. In one condition, the imprinting, which was their only experience in the light, happened in a rectangular chamber, and in the other condition, it happened in a cylindrical chamber with no spatially structured surfaces at particular distances or directions. And then both groups of chicks were tested in the rectangular room. The test object was the object of imprinting, so the method was a little different. The chick got to see mom in one corner while the chick was encased in plexiglass. He could see her, but he couldn't go there. Then the plexiglass was covered. He was spun around till he was disoriented. And when it was removed, mom was gone. And the question was, where would he go off in search of her? And the chicks went to the two appropriately geometrically structured corners of the room, in both conditions with no difference between them. So behaviorally, there's evidence that this system is used to guide reorientation the first time that the chicks encounter an appropriately structured environment. Still remains to be seen what's going to be happening at the level of neural mechanisms, and I hope controlled rearing studies are done to find that out. Now finally, and I'll be done with places, early place representations, obviously, I don't need to show you evidence that they guide learning the spatial structure of the environment. That's what the entire field of animal navigation is about, right? And the interesting new work suggesting that they also guide learning about aspects of the environment that were never directly experienced together. That if rats were constrained so that they could explore two different regions of a maze on different days but could never travel between them, that they would activate representations in the hippocampus of paths that connected those environments. So clearly, this place system is guiding learning. That's got to be, I think it's got to be its primary function. Now, place representations also predict children's learning of spatial symbols. This comes from work of Moira Dillon, who did experiments using a simple map task that a task that children can solve as early as about 2.5 years of age. You put them in an environment, she used the same cylindrical room that we've used for the reorientation studies, that has a triangular structure on the floor, and she shows a simple overhead map of that structure. And the map has a dot on it, and the child's task is to put an object in the location on the floor where the dot is on the map. Okay? And you see how well children can do that as over time, the map presents different locations where they have to place the object, and it presents the triangular arrangement at different orientations. The orientation changes on the map, and the child's orientation also changes in the environment. So it's kind of a challenging task, but kids are able to perform it above chance, and before and after performing it, a separate person in the lab tests them on two different geometrical abilities. One is their sensitivity to the shapes of visual forms, and I won't talk about that today, but the other is reorientation in rectangular rooms with different aspect ratios scaled to make the task more challenging. And what Molly found was that, first of all, the two spatial tasks at the bottom don't correlate with each other. I guess that's not surprising. Kids aren't using shapes of visual forms in reorienting. Second, and much more surprising to us, using the map in two different environments, one of which involved extended surfaces but no corners. We hoped that would activate the representations that are active during reorientation. And the other involving corners but no extended surfaces. We hoped that wouldn't activate them and thought it might activate a system for representing forms by their shapes. Those two tasks didn't correlate with each other, even though the maps were identical for the two tasks. But interestingly, each of the tasks on the bottom predicted performance on the corresponding task on top. Now, this is not an evidence for a causal relationship. We don't have data supporting that yet. That would require training studies if it were done on humans, or studies using other mechanisms, other methods. Nevertheless, it suggests that there's a line to be drawn between this basic ancient system by which we all find our way around in the world and uniquely human symbolic systems by which we communicate about the world to one another, learn to get around in Berlin by looking at maps and so forth. Okay, so I'm done talking about places. I've gone through this set of properties, and up till now, I've kind of presented them as if they're a laundry list of properties. What I want to suggest now is that actually these properties are deeply related to each other, and a system that has some of them is likely to have them all. So why do I say that? Well, let's start with what I think is the best supported conclusion from this literature on place representations, which is that they're ancient, that they evolved in an ancestor that's common to us and birds, and it looks like even fish, a very distant ancestor. It seems to me that any cognitive system that's that ancient will tend to capture abstract properties of the world, not concrete perceptible properties of the world. Suppose you're a fish, and you're living in some part of the ocean where there's a chemical gradient coming out of a spring. And you live there long enough that your species evolves the capacity to navigate by that chemical gradient, okay? What's going to happen over the next 400 million years of evolution from that ancestor to us? Well, we moved out of the ocean, we moved away from those chemical gradients. We are not going to be navigating. If we have an ancient system, it's not going to capture that chemical gradient. But no matter what environment you're in, whether you're underwater or above, whether you're a fish or a human, space is approximately Euclidean. And mechanisms for tracking abstract Euclidean properties of the world, like distance and direction, will continue to be effective across vast changes over evolutionary time. So to the extent that we have ancient mechanisms, we shouldn't be surprised to find that the properties that they're capturing are abstract properties of the world. What's more, abstract properties of the world, because they're useful everywhere, aren't going to go away. Well, I guess I'm jumping ahead of myself. Okay, in addition, they're going to depend on relatively localized neural systems because there's going to be a lot of brain evolution between the fish and us, which will change things around a lot. If the system were highly distributed, it would probably be perturbed over the other evolutionary changes that were happening. So it'll probably depend on a relatively delimited neural system. And abstract properties are hard to learn. So the mechanism by which animals over hundreds of millions of years of evolution would become sensitive to properties of the world that are abstract and enduring would likely be built in. You wouldn't trust it to chance that these be discovered by some trial and error process. And finally, anything that's ancient and useful in all environments is very likely not to simply be scaffolding that's there to get development going when you're an infant that's subsequently thrown away. Because these are abilities that will continue to be useful to us throughout our lives, sensitivity to the geometrical structure of space in the case that I'm talking about. So I think these properties all go together. They form a natural kind. And this kind, I hope, gives you a sense of the kind of cognitive system that's at work here. It's a system that sits between perception on the one hand, it's after visual perception, and our explicit beliefs about the world, right? I mean, I didn't say anything about this, but we run adults in studies of reorientation. We spin them around in rectangular rooms. We ask them to go find their keys, and they go to the two correct corners, right? I mean, they do just what the kids do. But if we then ask them, why did you go there? They'll say, I have no idea. I just had a hunch it might be there. Or they might say, I think it was the length of the walls, right? Which we've now shown that, in fact, we don't. I thought, I ran myself in these studies, and for years I thought it was the length of the walls, not the distance of the walls. So it's not a system of, these aren't systems of explicit beliefs, but they are systems that are situated between perception and belief and serving as a foundation for learning and the development of knowledge, including, I think, although I didn't show you yet any evidence for that, knowledge that is specifically statable, symbolic, and maybe unique to humans. Okay, so that brings me then to, I guess I have 15 minutes to talk about how children go beyond core knowledge. Okay, that should do it. There's a number of areas in which this is being actively studied in developmental psychology. I've listed a bunch of them here. Somewhere between 3 and 5 years of age, kids undergo a radical conceptual change when they come to understand that number is something that you can count and represent exactly with no upper bound. I won't talk about that today, but it's a really interesting change that happens before kids go to school and serves as a basis for, when kids are ready to learn symbolic arithmetic once they undergo this conceptual change. I talked briefly about developing abilities to navigate by maps, which first emerges at about 2.5 years of age. There's a huge field in developmental psychology focused on reasoning about the mind and the development of a conception of mental states as conveying a particular perspective on the world. Philosophers call this mental state notion propositional attitudes, because you have a you have a perspective on the way the world is. You're not simply representing the way the world is, but the way the world is from a particular perspective. And there's also growing work on moral reasoning. But the case I want to talk about today is tools and tool use, because I think it's the first of these changes to happen. It happens at the earliest point in development of any of these other abilities. The others are all happening around the middle of the preschool years, between 3 and 5 years of age, 2.5 and 5 years of age. But tool use is coming in at the end of the first year. So it may be the simplest of these systems, the simplest example to be looking at. And I should say that what I take to be uniquely human about the tool learning that we see in young children is not the fact that they're learning to use tools, because lots of animals learn to use tools. I mean, some of the crows are really brilliant at it. It's the fact that they come to have a view of the world that every object out there, and this has been studied and shown to be the case well before kids start school, at about age 3 or 4, they come to have the view that every object out there is a member of a kind with a dedicated form and function. If it's a living object, it might be a function for itself. If it's a tool, an artifact, it's going to be a function for us. And they go around the world systematically asking, what's this and what's it for, of everything that's out there, okay? That, I think, is something that's unique to humans. It doesn't seem to be there in chimpanzees or other non-human primates, and it doesn't seem to be there in the birds, even though they're brilliant at using tools for purposes where they've already discovered, here's a function I want. They're really good at getting a tool for it. But this attitude that says, I have no idea what the function of this is, but I take it to be a kind of thing that somebody gave a function to, right? And they structured it to be this way because it has a function. It's that kind of productive system of concepts that emerges in kids. And I think in every one of these areas, what we see is children learning productively, whole systems, in some cases infinitely generable systems of new concepts. So let's talk about tools. In order to talk about tools, I think I need to give you 2 or 3 slides on core knowledge of objects and agents. I'll do this as fast as I can. First of all, objects. Lots of study of human infants going down as young as about 2 months of age, in a couple of areas going down to newborns, showing that when babies look out at visual arrays of surfaces, they parse those arrays into objects by seeing what moves together with what, both when things are visible and when they're partly hidden behind occluders, and seeing what things are moving continuously through space and over time in cases where things move in and out of view, in situations where there is or isn't a gap between the hiding places where the object has been successively seen. Kids, there's also evidence that infants as young as 2 or 2.5 months represent objects as solid and impenetrable. So if an object moves behind a screen and there's an obstacle in its path, they expect to see it in front of that obstacle, not on the far side of the obstacle. And they expect objects to interact with one another on contact. So if an object goes behind, a moving object goes behind a screen, and after it's disappeared, a stationary object, which was already standing behind the screen, starts to move out from behind the screen, infants infer that the first object hit the second, not that they acted on each other at a distance. Now, in all of these cases, as in the case of place representations that I talked about, the input to these object representations is something like a 2.5D representation of the visible spatial layout. That is to say, objects aren't constructed from pixels, directly from pixels. They're constructed from something like a 2.5D sketch of the visible environment. So for example, when I say things moving together are seen as on one object, that's the case whether they're moving in a way that causes retinal displacement in the visual field when they're moving horizontally, or if they're moving in depth, or if they're moving vertically with no such displacement. And if you do heroic experiments like Phil Kellman did, and you take babies and you move the babies, so you dissociate retinal motion from real motion, it's the real motion that matters to the object system. So they're happening after perception of the surface layout, and they're according with these basic constraints on how things can and cannot move. And research shows that these constraints are interconnected for infants. They aren't just a list of unrelated properties of objects. If you perturb one, if you show an object that violates one of the constraints, that influences the infant's application of the other constraints to their motion. But object representations are limited, and to get you to tools, I do need to tell you about a limit to them that came out in these beautiful experiments by Fei Xu and Susan Carey, where they showed infants events in which one object went behind a screen. Was it a ball? No, a shoe. And then another object, a toy duck, comes out from the other side of the screen. And the question to the infants is how many things are back there? And the two options they're given are two objects, a duck and a shoe, or one object, just a duck. And their looking time to those two events is compared to looking time of infants who get the same test events after an unrelated familiarization display, the prediction being that they will look longer at the unexpected event where the wrong number of objects comes out. Yet the findings of this study were that at 10 months of age, as old as 10 months of age, infants seem to be neutral between the two options, whether there's one object back there or two objects back there. Now, that could have been because they didn't remember the objects or weren't paying attention to them, but further experiments by Xu and Carey show that that's not the case. First of all, they do attend to the featural changes between one object and another, because while the things are successively appearing on the two sides of the screen, babies look at that event longer if there's two different objects coming out on the two sides than if there's just one object coming out on both sides. But second, babies make the same error at 10 months when nothing is hidden and nothing needs to be remembered. When Fei Xu simply took a duck and put it on top of a truck and asked babies, in effect, how many things are here, one or two, by taking a hand, lifting the duck by the head, and either the duck moved on its own or both objects moved together, the infants were neutral between those two outcomes. They didn't expect that these two objects would move independently of each other. So it looks like they're detecting object features, but they're not using them in these tasks. Now, interestingly, they went a step further and saw what kids did with the objects at this time. And by the time they're 10 months of age, they're absolutely capable of recognizing a truck as something familiar. Some of the kids would make noises that imitated the sound of the truck. Some of them would try to wheel it around, roll it around on its wheels on the floor. So they seemed not to be insensitive either to the forms or to the functions of these objects, but they're not using them in tracking the objects over time and determining where and space, and determining where one of them ends and the next begins. So it looks like they're representing the objects as bodies that are solid, impenetrable, continuously movable, but not as kinds with specific forms and functions. Now, babies do, early on, use forms and functions to represent people and animals. The form of a face, they distinguish an appropriately formed from an inappropriately formed face. They distinguish faces that differ quite subtly by whether someone is looking at them or not. They look longer at someone who looks at them. They're sensitive to biological motion in point light displays of moving walkers. They'll discriminate someone who's right side up from someone who's upside down, someone who's walking to the left from someone who's walking to the right, even if they're walking on treadmills, so they're not being displaced. It's only the relative motion that they could be detecting. And babies very early on are sensitive to the gestures that people make, and they even try subtly and not very successfully to imitate some of those gestures. Now, interestingly, infants' representations of agents are highly non-specific from a species point of view. So studies have been done with newborn humans and newly hatched chicks, where each participant is presented with images of point-light motion from both species. So you can ask, is there any preference for a human infant to see a human walker as opposed to a walking hen? And the answer is no. Similarly, studies of face perception have presented human infants not only with human faces, but with monkey faces, sheep faces, and bird faces. There is no preference in a sufficiently young infant before about 3 months. There is no preference for a human face over a face of any of those other animals, okay? So this is a very non-specific representation. Nevertheless, it does take account of forms and functions. And an important thing happens in older infants when you present objects that have the form or the function of an animal, of an agent, like a face or a pattern of independent self-propelled motion or both. What happens is that infants use that to infer that the animal is causing its own motion and also causing the motion of anything else that moves with it. These are beautiful experiments that were conducted by Sabine Pauen, who is somewhere in Germany now. I should know where. She used this animal ball that moves around on its own, and then after kids have seen it moving, she takes apart the animal and the ball and sees which object they expect to be continuing to move now that they're separated. And the mechanism of motion is actually inside the ball. But the infants are all looking at the guy with animate features, expecting the movement to come from there. But these infants were 7 months of age, so they could have easily learned that things with face features tend to move around on their own and other things don't. So let me tell you about a brand new experiment from Shari Liu, and then I really will be done. You know what? I'm not going to tell you about it. We did this with 3-month-old infants. 3-month-old infants are interesting because they don't have any experience reaching for objects and manipulating them. Babies don't start to become capable of doing that until 4.5 months of age, actually coordinating the movements of extending your arm, opening the palm, closing in on the object, exerting the appropriate amount of pressure. Reaching is a really hard action for young infants, and they can't do it at all. But when we show, and they also don't understand other people's reaching actions, but we showed them simple causal events in which a person doesn't have to pick anything up. They simply touch an object and they activate a light and a sound. And we find that babies perceive that event as causal, and they expect it to be efficient. So these are two properties of agents which, like distance and direction for places, are going to be true of agents everywhere, whether they're fish or chicks or humans, and going to be a useful guide for learning what people's intentions are, what actions they're trying to perform, what states of the world they're trying to bring about. And that all seems to be the skeletal abstract notions you need for that understanding seem to be there by 3 months of age before infants are able to engage in these actions themselves. Sorry, I rushed through that so badly. In any case, I want to get to the change that occurs as promised that I think points to a new way of learning that comes in at the end of the first year. So in Shu and Carey's experiments, this happened between 10 and 12 months of age. At 10 months, as I said, babies are neutral between whether one or two distinct objects participated in these events, where things appeared on opposite sides of a screen. By 12 months, they expect 2 objects. At 11 months, their expectation is predicted from their mastery of the names of the objects that were used in the experiment. So parents who said that the kid seemed to understand the word duck and the word shoe were more likely to have kids who succeeded at the task at that intermediate age. That led Shu to go on and do a series of studies where she took somewhat younger infants, presented these events where objects are coming out in alternation on 2 sides of the screen, and accompanied them by language. And she showed with those manipulations that as long as the baby can see that you're using different words for the things that come out on one side and the thing that comes out on the other side, they don't even need to know the words. You can make them up. You can say, look, oblicate, as one thing comes out, and look, atoma, as the other thing comes out. And the child will infer that there are two distinct objects behind the screen. On the other hand, if you make two different sounds that don't have noun phrases in them, if you say ooh for one of them and ew for the other one, then kids don't infer two objects, okay? It's only when they're hearing two noun phrases that they infer two objects. And she went on to show they not only expect, I won't go through the experiments, but they not only expect two objects, but they expect that if you've used one word twice and you show two objects, they will have the same form and function. There'll be two different instances of the same kind. Whereas if you use two different words and you show two objects, they'll have different forms and different functions. So what could language be doing here? Well, what seems to matter, kids start recognizing individual isolated words as early as about 6 months of age. But toward the end of the first year is when they first seem to start being sensitive to the grammatical properties of the words that can connect a sequence of words into a sentence that can express a thought. And in particular, what's critical, I think, here is that the objects are being referred to by singular noun phrases. The meanings of the words, in the cases where kids know them, like cup, they're picking out things that are bodies with dedicated forms and functions. So the words are getting connected to representations from three different systems of core knowledge. But in addition, they're being spoken by a person who's calling the child's attention to the object and inviting the child to share an experience with them, which is the central abstract notion for that seems to be activated when kids see other people engaging with them and looking at them. An invitation to share an experience of them, an experience of a thing with, that's a body with a particular form and function. So I think what's going on is that at the end of the first year, kids have learned enough of their language that they understand people's sentences that are expressing simple thoughts. In this case, a thought about a cup. And once they do this, children are now in a position to see what words other people choose to use and not use in these expressions. And I think they can reason that, look, if the person was trying to tell me about three things that were all the same, she'd be using the same word throughout. If she's making a distinction in the words she's using, there must be some important distinction among the things that she's referring to, or it wouldn't be helpful to be doing that. And I think in this way, the speech that kids are hearing conveys to kids that people who are talking to them and sharing their experiences are marking distinctions that it's worth the child's while to be having. So more generally, the suggestion is this, that language gives us a unique system for composing concepts from core concepts in accord with productive rules, because we can take individual words of that language and we can order them together in accord with productive rules. It consists of an open-ended lexicon, so you can add new words throughout your life. Rules for forming new expressions that depend only on the grammatical properties of the lexical items, not on their meaning. So once you learn a new word, once you know what the grammatical class of that word is, you can combine it with all sorts of other words without having to work out in advance what the different meanings of those different expressions would be. The meanings of the full expressions depend on the meanings of the words and the rules that order them. And I think the most important property of natural language is the pragmatics of language use, that speakers tend to be efficient, they try to be helpful, and they try to be relevant to the situation at hand. And if a child is built to be sensitive to efficiency, which was the 3-month study that I rushed through, that infants expect other people's actions to be as efficient as the conditions allow, and relevant to the situation, and an invitation to share a thought about that situation. With those assumptions, I think language becomes a powerful tool for pointing kids to the conceptual distinctions that matter for people like them in the society and the particular moment that they're in at the point where they're learning their language. Now, if you take these properties of language together, they show a quite remarkable property, I think, that language has in general, which is language allows you to learn things about the world from language alone. And in fact, most of what we know about the world, we know in one way or another through language. We've read it in books. We heard it in a talk like this. Somebody told it to us. Language informs us of things happening impossibly far away from us that we could never know about directly. And I think most of what we know, we learn that way. Remarkably, studies have shown that young children start learning that way all the way back at the beginning of language learning. As soon as they have any words at all, they will use the words that they have to make out the meanings of, to narrow down on the meanings of other words. You can learn a whole lot about words like to and pet from situations that involve no to-ness and no pets, if you hear a sentence like the one I put up there. Now, I submit that only humans learn like this. I would love to see tests of the border collie who learned 200 nouns, but as far as I know, they were all learned by ostension. They were shown an object, they were given the word. Okay? Most of what we learn, including as children, we're not learning by ostension. We're learning in this other way, via other people and their pragmatically appropriate speech. So the suggestion is that language learning allows us to learn rapidly, productively, and flexibly because, on the one hand, language is an extremely powerful system. Its rules allow you to basically express you can coin new words and then use the rules to express any concepts that you're able to come up with. Words and phrases are a very economical way of expressing those concepts. But I think most importantly, because children are learning the language from other people in their culture, and other people are speaking about things that are useful and relevant to the situation that they're in, language is a really good way of guiding a creature like a child with a productively combinatorial mind through the huge search space of possibilities that such a mind can contemplate to zero in on which of these possible concepts is actually relevant to me now. But I can see that I am out of time. So let me stop right there. What I've offered in this last part of the talk is a hypothesis, not a conclusion. And the main point that I want to make about it is I think it's a testable hypothesis, and there are other testable hypotheses that can also be pursued. To make progress in this field, I think we need to recognize that everything that children learn at every point in our lives, in everything we learn, we are building on what we already know. And when we're learning as very young children, the primary things that we're building on are the systems of core knowledge, like the place system, so richly studied by so many people in CCN, the CCN field. These systems are serving as a foundation, and to the extent that we understand those systems, we can leverage that understanding to put us in the right place to be thinking about the learning problem that the child has. Then I think the one other thing we really need to understand is how children communicate with other people, because almost everything that they learn through the people around them. Almost everything we learn throughout our lives, I think we learn through the people around them as we communicate, especially by language. So these all seem to me like hard problems, but solvable problems through the interdisciplinary enterprise that you have here. So thanks for listening. I just want to get to the thank you slide.